including this month, is 100 years since the Great General Transport Strike in Liverpool in 1911. This wasn't your average strike, certainly not compared to any strike seen recently in this country, and this was also seen as the case in 1911. In 1911, for instance, the Mayor of Liverpool complained that a revolution was in progress, and the Mayor wasn't the only one. For the upper and middle classes of Britain, at least in 1911, Liverpool seemed to be on the edge of a full-scale workers' revolution. It didn't go that far, but this wasn't necessarily clear at the time. So what I'm going to be covering in this half hour is first the Liverpool strike itself, from the beginning to the end. I'm going to give some background information here, but then I'm also going to look back and ask, why Liverpool and why 1911? So I'm going to look not just at Liverpool, but also at the bigger picture. The great wave of working class revolt that swept Britain and Ireland in the years before the First World War, which is known as the Labour unrest. I'm also going to look briefly at the impact of syndicalism, which is revolutionary trade unionism, on the Liverpool strikes. So starting with the strike. When you look at any great mass events, it's not just the Liverpool General Transport Strike of 1911, but also other great working class revolts and revolutions. One question worth asking is, how much of what happened was actually planned? How much was spontaneous? And to what extent does collective action create new opportunities, which in turn generate new action? How much does collective action itself create its own momentum, leading to outcomes which no one thought possible at first? You get all these possible causes in the Liverpool strike of 1911. The first phase was definitely planned, or as well planned as it could be at the time, and started with a national seamen's strike across Britain and Ireland. The strike was organised by two unions. The first was a seamen's strike, the National Sailors and Firemen's Union, to give its full name. And firemen in this case is because this was the aim of steamships powered by coal. So firemen here kept the fires going rather than putting them out. The other union was a steward union, the National Union of Ship Stewards, Cooks, Butchers and Bakers, based in Liverpool. Now there are many reasons for the seamen's strike. Pay was one of them. Between 1900 and 1910, many workers, not just seamen, had effectively had a 10% wage cut, as wages failed to keep pace with rising prices. There were also bad working conditions, including a degrading medical exam every time seamen signed up for a voyage. Unions were banned, and the employers, many organised in their own union or cartel, the Shipping Federation, very much held the whip hand. So these were the conditions. But in 1910, a trade boom had been gathering pace. This meant less unemployment and less competition for jobs. So if any time was the right time to strike, 1911 was it. This was a very important strike for union recognition, and Liverpool was one of the most important ports in Britain. So the best man for the job, Tom Mann, was asked by the leader of the Seamen's Union, Havelock Wilson, to lead the strike in Liverpool. 100 years ago, Tom Mann was one of the great figures in the workers' movement in Britain. In his life, his activism spanned many political movements and many union struggles. But there are two things Tom Mann is most famous for. The first is his leadership, along with Ben Tillett, the dockers leader, of the 1889 London dock strike. The second is his leadership of the Liverpool transport strike of 1911. Any history of the Liverpool transport strike has to mention Tom Mann. Often these mention that he was a socialist or trade union leader. Well, this is true, but in 1911 and sometime before, Tom Mann was the most famous syndicalist or revolutionary trade unionist in Britain. Here's what Tom Mann wrote in May 1911, not long before the Liverpool strikes. I declare in favour of direct industrial organisation, not as a means, but as the means whereby the workers can ultimately overthrow the capitalist system and become the actual controllers of their industrial and social destiny. The Seamen's Union have been preparing for this strike since mid-1910, with organising meetings held across the country. In Liverpool, final preparations for the strike included what the press called a monster demonstration at St George's Plateau on the 31st of May. The next day, in Liverpool, saw the first national conference of the Transport Workers Federation. The aim of the Transport Workers Federation, formed in 1910 on Tom Mann's initiative, was to unite all transport workers in one organisation, and at this conference all transport workers were urged to support the seamen. The official date for the strike was set for June the 15th, but, and this is where spontaneity starts to push the movement forward, the strike actually started 6 days early in Southampton. Other ports also came out early, including Liverpool. In Liverpool, on the 14th of June, 500 firemen refused to sign on for 3 ships. Tom Mann, the chair of the Liverpool Strike Committee, declared the strike officially begun. Now, the first thing to note about this shipping strike in Liverpool and elsewhere was a total solidarity between stewards and other seamen. All seamen struck together without petty social snobbery getting in the way, because sometimes stewards were seen as a bit better than firemen and stuff. The second thing to note was a solidarity action in Liverpool from dockers on every ship involved in strike action, and also the sympathy of the carters. The carters were the workers who moved goods from the docks using horses and carts. This was before lorries were common. This support from dockers came from both union and non-union members alike, and this solidarity worked. The attempt to use scabs failed totally. By the end of June, all the shipping companies in Liverpool, that's companies like the Cunard Line, the White Star Line and Canadian Pacific, had caved in and accepted the union demands. Then, as the seamen's strike ended, the dockers struck for their own demands. Now here you need to know a bit about the Liverpool waterfront. If you look at any map today, you can still see most of the dock system in 1911. Today, most of this is partly derelict or partly surrounded by luxury apartments. But in 1911, the very northmost docks, the Seaforth container port and the docks just next to it, were built, and a couple of the South End docks look like they've been filled in. But otherwise, the dock system is pretty much as it was in 1911. The South docks, that's south of the pier head, were already mostly unionised by 1911. The North docks were newer and bigger than the South docks, and this is where the bigger steamships companies were based. In the North docks, unions were banned, and this included the National Union of Dock Labourers, based in Liverpool and led at this time by James Sexton. Anyone openly in a union would be sacked, and dismissal and blacklisting was all the easier due to the casual nature of the work on the docks. Every day in 1911, around 20,000 dockers would line up at the docks for a day's work. And if you compare that with the 500 Liverpool dockers involved in the 1985 to 1998 docks dispute. So in this situation, the strike at the north end of the docks was mainly a fight for union recognition. The dockers struck on the 28th of June. By the evening, 10,000 men were out. As with the seamen, union members and non-union members came out together, and new members flooded into the union. 2,000 coal heavers, these are the workers who heaved coal onto the steamships, also joined the strike. Now the seamen, who had already won their strike, struck in support of the dockers. The strike committee, led by Tom Mann, also took up the dockers' demands. And again, solidarity between workers produced results. Within a week, nearly all firms had recognised the union. Outstanding issues of wages and conditions were dealt with at a conference held at the end of the month, with a settlement agreed on the 3rd of August. Then the railway men in Liverpool went on strike. Unlike with the seamen and dockers, this wasn't a strike for union recognition. The railway unions were recognised, but as with many unions then and now, the union leaders were sold on the idea of arbitration to avoid strikes. Arbitration or conciliation usually went in favour of the bosses, so many railwaymen weren't happy with the results. So on Saturday, the 5th of August, railwaymen at a railway depot in Great Howard Street, near the North Docks, began an unofficial strike. The strike spread. The strike committee called on all railwaymen in Liverpool to come out and all other transport workers to give assistance. And by the 10th of August, 15,000 goods porters were on strike in Liverpool. By the end of the week, the strike had spread nationally, forcing the railway unions to call the first ever national rail strike on 17th of August. Meanwhile, events in Liverpool had turned ugly. The ship owners had declared there would be a lockout unless dockers moved boycotted railway goods. They did this partly because, from the 9th of August, the authorities had begun to bring in extra police and extra troops. Something like 2,400 police and 5,000 troops were eventually in Liverpool to deal with the strike. This was the situation when a union demonstration took place on August the 13th. This became known as Bloody Sunday. On the 13th of August, tens of thousands of workers and their families marched from both ends of the city to St George's Plateau near North Lime Street. Fred Bower, who was a syndicalist stonemason and an eyewitness to all this, wrote how the march from Garston included a band half made up of Roman Catholics and half from an orange band, with a drum major's baton decked in orange and green ribbons. As we know, the chances of that happening today are not very likely. But in the 1900s, Liverpool was much more split by sectarian divisions than today. In 1909, there had been weeks of sectarian rioting and one death. So working class solidarity in the face of religious sectarianism was an important point to make. An estimated 100,000 people took part in the rally at St George's Plateau. This was peaceful. Then, after a small scuffle in Lord Nelson Street, near the side entrance of Lime Street Station, the police attacked in force. They attacked violently, repeatedly, and using horses to clear the plateau. Fred Bower, who I've just mentioned, recalled how, at the end, the plateau resembled a battlefield, disabled and wounded men, women and children lying singly and in heaps over a vast area. All this was filmed by at least 3 film cameras, 2 organised by the unions and 1 by the film company Pathé. The police confiscated the union film and Pathé was warned never to show their film in public. Most of the famous pictures of the 1911 strike, and I put a few of them at the back there, including of the mass demonstration, are by a local company called Carbonara. 4 pictures from this series of photos were destroyed by the police. So, unless there's some old film locked in a vault somewhere, we don't have any pictures at all of this police atrocity. There were 2 responses to this attack. First, there was street fighting against the police, especially in the north end of the city. The Times called this guerrilla warfare, with barricades set up on Netherfields Road, including barbed wire. On Tuesday, the 15th of August, 2 workers, Michael Prendergast and John Sutcliffe, were shot dead by troops on Vauxhall Road during a mass attack to free convicted rioters being taken to Walton Jail. The second response to Bloody Sunday was by the strike committee, which declared a general strike. The transport industry in Liverpool, including the docks, shut down completely. More troops, a gunboat, etc., were sent to the Mersey. Goods such as milk, bread and other essentials were allowed to move by the strike committee using a system of permits. but other goods moving were only under heavy army protection. On the 19th of August, the railway employers caved in after the government stepped in to force a solution. This solution was a return to work with no dismissals and a commission to be set up on the dispute. The railwaymen resumed work on the 22nd of August. But it wasn't quite over. The strike committee had to threaten a national strike in support of tramway workers sacked by the city council until the council backed down and promised reinstatements. With that, the strike committee ordered a general resumption of work and wound itself up on the 24th of August. So this strike, or series of strikes, lasted 72 days or so. Some man reckoned that even before the railwaymen went on strike, 70,000 workers in Liverpool had obtained improved conditions. This didn't just include dockers, but other groups of workers who had unionised and gone on strike. This included tugboat crews, warehouse workers, ferry workers, cotton porters and others. So the Liverpool General Transport Strike of 1911 has rightly been regarded as a great working class victory. The question I want to look at into more detail now is, why Liverpool and why 1911? Now I've already mentioned some of the reasons: bad pay and bad working conditions. We can also add bad living conditions, slum housing and people living on the edge generally. This was a time when there were over 700,000 people living in Liverpool compared to 400,000 people today. And Liverpool was much smaller in area than today. If you look at any map of the time, Liverpool proper ends around Newsham Park, and Old Swan and Egbert are more or less villages out in the sticks. So as I've said, the fact that there was an economic boom is important, but mass poverty, slums and economic booms aren't enough as an explanation. So this is when we need to look at the bigger picture, at the power of example and the mass working class revolt in Britain and Ireland before the First World War, known as the Labour Unrest. Now I won't be going into the Labour Unrest in detail, as I want to keep the focus on Liverpool, but in brief, for Liverpool we need to start with the Belfast Dock Strike of 1907. Jim Larkin, who was born in Toxteth and is generally regarded as the greatest Labour leader Ireland has ever seen, organised the Belfast Dockers for the Liverpool-based National Union of Dock Labourers. The Dockers struck, the Carters came out in support, 100,000 people marched, orange and green together, in support of the strike. But troops were sent in, and 3 people were shot dead by the army. In 1910, the South Wales miners went on strike. In what became known as the Tonopandi riots, 1 striker was killed. In 1911, as we've seen, we had the National Seamen's Strike, the Liverpool Transport Strikes, and the first National Rail Strikes. During the railway strikes, troops bayonet charged strikers at Llanelli in South Wales, and 2 workers were shot dead. In 1912, there was the first ever national miners' strike, and this was a time when there were over 1 million miners in Britain. In 1913, the strike wave hit the Midlands and engineering. 1913 also saw the Dublin lockout, often seen as the most important labour dispute in Ireland's history. This was led by Jim Larkin again, now the head of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. Over 20,000 workers were involved. 2 people were killed by police and 1 was killed by a scab. Dublin had its own Bloody Sunday in August 1913, when again the police attacked a peaceful demonstration. In 1914, the building trades were involved, leading to a building trades lockout in London involving 40,000 building workers. The number of deaths gives some idea of the nature and the intensity of these strikes. So the Liverpool strikes of 1911 have to be seen as part of a much wider movement involving workers across Britain and Ireland. Now it could be argued that everything that happened before the First World War was just pure and simple trade unionism in action. A lot of trade union leaders of the time weren't revolutionaries, and there had been a previous mass wave of strikes 20 years or so previously. Now there's a lot of truth in this, but while there were many similarities with the past, what happened in 1910 and 1911 was also very different. So this is why we have to look not just to the previous history of trade unionism in Britain, but also to the ideas then sweeping through the labour movements around the world. And by this I mean syndicalism, revolutionary trade unionism. Here's what the Liverpool Echo wrote on the 16th of August 1911, in the middle of the Liverpool general strike. Headlines of "Behind the Labour Unrest, the Preaching of Syndicalism." And the article follows: "The present movement has much in common with the syndicalist movement which paralysed France," and continues: "There is no doubt that the strikes are very largely the result of the gospel preached by the direct actionists who condemn parliamentary or constitutional agitation as futile and barren in results." So the Echo saw syndicalism as a main driving force behind what happened in Liverpool. Syndicat is the French for trade union, and the English use of the word syndicalism is a shortened version of what in France was called revolutionary syndicalism or revolutionary trade unionism. The Echo article also picks up on the phrase direct actionist. Direct action is a term which also comes straight from French syndicalism. Direct action here meaning the collective industrial power of the working class compared to the indirect action of relying on politicians. Tom Mann is also clear in his memoirs that syndicalism came from France, and the people most responsible for developing French syndicalism as a workers' movement were the French anarchists. In 1910, Tom Mann had founded the Industrial Syndicalist Education League and a paper, The Industrial Syndicalist. And as I said, in 1911, Tom Mann was the most famous syndicalist in Britain. He's also been described by local historian Harold Hykins as the most experienced and probably the most influential trade unionist of the day. He was a famous public speaker and organiser, and I don't think any historian can pretend that Tom Mann wasn't an important part of the 1911 strikes. And to the extent that Tom Mann was influential in the transport strikes, you have to say, I believe, that syndicalism was an influence. But syndicalism was a lot more than Tom Mann, impressive though he was. Joe Cotter, the founder and leader of the Steward Union, was also at this time a syndicalist. And there were other syndicalists on the Liverpool Strike Committee. So you'd think by now historians would generally agree on the part syndicalism played in Liverpool in 1911. But if you did think that, you'd be wrong. On the one hand, you have Bob Alton, who's looked more closely at syndicalism in Liverpool than any other historian. He wrote, "Over the course of the Liverpool strikes, the impact of syndicalism was clearly significant." Local historian Harold Hykins, who I've already mentioned, has stated that the activities of these direct action socialists, i.e. the syndicalists, had a profound effect on these events. Very much on the other hand, however, are people like Eric Taplin, also a local labour historian. In Eric Taplin's book on the Dockers Union, he writes, "Revolutionary syndicalism appears to have been an insignificant feature of the Liverpool transport strike." So who do you believe? Now we know historians are notorious for disagreeing totally about the same facts, but there's also a much bigger issue. What we're talking about here in 1911 is a mass rank-and-file working-class revolt. Most history depends on written records, but most working-class people don't leave much of a written record, especially back in 1911. That also goes for working-class union activists. If a working-class militant becomes branch secretary of a union, they become part of the union records, so part of history. A union activist who doesn't become an official may never have existed as far as the records show. And even union archives aren't always there. The Dockers Union, for instance, sold off all its archives for scrap paper in the 1950s, which is a big problem if you're an historian. But we are lucky in Liverpool because quite a lot of research has been done into rank and file activism here. And there are other sources if you look. So I'll finish this talk by looking at a couple of local syndicalists active in Liverpool in 1911, Fred Bower and Peter Larkin. Fred Bower, I think, has become a bit of a local hero to historians because he actually wrote his autobiography, published in 1936, called Rolling Stonemason, because he was a stonemason. You can get it in the library. Now, it's incredibly rare for a working class person who wasn't famous to write an autobiography, especially back then. And he did it, if you read his book, because he was more or less destitute, with silicosis, living in a hut on the Wirral. And there was a competition for the best autobiography. And because of this, potluck really, we have one of the very few working class eyewitnesses accounts of 1911. And Fred Bower was also a syndicalist and active in Tom Mann's Industrial Syndicalist Education League. Moving on to Peter Larkin. We know a bit about Peter Larkin, partly because he was the younger brother of the famous Jim Larkin, but also because he is mentioned in the labour histories of England, Australia and Ireland. In Ireland, he's mostly known for founding the Workers' Union of Ireland in 1924. His obituary in the Irish Worker in 1931 mentioned that he was a member and active worker and organiser of, among other unions, the National Union of Dock Labourers based in Liverpool. Peter Larkin was an anarcho-syndicalist, and in 1911 he was working as a coal heaver on the docks. Peter Larkin was also one of those militants who saw much more potential from the transport strikes than just an increase in wages. In the anarchist paper Freedom in July 1911, in the midst of the unrest in Liverpool, he wrote, "The culminating object of the workers should be the capture of the means of production." So it started with the fears of the upper and middle classes that Liverpool was heading for a workers' revolution. And it ended with a Scout anarcho-syndicalist coal heaver hoping for and working for that same workers' revolution. And obviously that revolution never happened. After the strikes, workers still often lived in slums. Religious sectarianism didn't magically disappear, and this was all in the dark days of the British Empire. But 1911 is worth commemorating. This is not just to recognise the struggles and victories of the past, and 1911 was a great victory, but also what we can take from 1911 is massive inspiration as to the power of working class solidarity. 1911 also shows the power and the possibilities of direct action in its original syndicalist sense. When workers unite across boundaries and take action for a common cause, what seemed impossible yesterday can become reality today.